So the presentation this week focuses on the development of second language acquisition and how it proceeds through various stages. And many of the terms that are identified in this chapter are often very commonly confused. So I wanted to highlight a few of those that are commonly confused with each other and explain how their similarities and differences. So first of all, we have the concept of transfer, which is where ideas from the L1 transfer to the L2 or move over to the L2. So this could include things like cognates. For example, if you have a word in your language like familia or familia, something like that, and then the English word is family, that would be an example of transfer, where either the vocabulary or the grammar patterns or systems are something that people move from their first language to their second language. So transfer by itself is kind of neutral. It isn't necessarily positive, helpful, or negative, unhelpful, where interference is sometimes actually called negative transfer. That's where something is different in the second, between the first language and second language, and the difference causes some sort of barrier or block to the acquisition. So, for example, in Spanish, if we have plural adjectives, like or the adjective goes after the noun in Spanish. That's different, right, from in English. In English, we would say the nice brothers, but in Spanish, someone might say the brothers nice, or the brothers nices, trying to make it plural, because the L1 of Spanish is interfering with their acquisition of English. So I think the most important thing to remember there is that transfer by itself isn't positive or negative, but interference is generally considered negative in some way, where the L1 is blocking acquisition of the L2. Overgeneralization is something that we actually had before when we were learning about first language acquisition, which is where anyone who's learning a language might apply one pattern that they have learned to all elements of a set, even if it doesn't apply. So, for example, if we have walk, walked, talk, talked, we have eat, eated, right? So that's a rule. So overgeneralization doesn't involve anything crossing over from the L1 to the L2. It's just in whatever language is being learned. That somebody applies a rule, like the ED for the past tense, to all verbs instead of recognizing that some of them are irregular verbs. Okay, so keep that in mind, that overgeneralization does not involve transfer, moving things over from one language to another. Another important concept from this chapter was the concept of markedness, or the idea that some language features are more natural across all languages, and those are considered unmarked. So structures or features of any language that are marked are much harder to acquire. So how these are determined as which ones are more natural is sort of up for debate. So this theory it's definitely more along the hypothesis level. Another commonly confused term might be developmental sequence compared to formulaic sequence. So a developmental sequence would mean that people generally acquire, for example, morphemes, parts of a language in a certain order. That always happens as part of their developmental stages. Where a formulaic sequence would be something that people learn to say as what we could call a chunk of language, like someone who can say pleased to meet you, but not much else in English. Okay, so something where people learn a phrase or a fixed expression and always use it in whatever language they're learning. Finally, I wanted to mention about fossilization and avoidance, two more very important terms. So the concept of fossilization takes its roots in the idea of an interlanguage system. That's a mental system mental representation of the L2 that the learner, has inside their head or instantiates in their mind, right? So with fossilization, certain errors that take place multiple times become kind of stuck or fossilized in the brain, and actually sometimes become much harder to change or to improve with new information. So, for example, my second language is Spanish, and I have certain structures that I like to think of it as I've said them wrong so many times that they became stuck or fossilized in my brain. So to me, inside my own interlanguage, they seem natural, but they're incorrect. So to work on fossilized structures really takes a lot of conscious, explicit effort from learners. Avoidance would be a structure that someone simply tries not to use, that they might work around or rephrase instead of using a structure because maybe we think we don't know how to say it correctly. Okay, so those are both things that happen to people during their development of a second language learning, that they might either have things that are in their brain almost in the wrong way, or things that they know they're never going to say, they're going to try to avoid as part of their process. So this chapter also talks about certain skill areas and how they develop during the L2 acquisition process. So as we know, phonology, pronunciation, is a part of second language acquisition that is very strongly linked to age. So it's generally thought, and we'll study this more in our chapter about age, that people who are learning who begin learning a second language at a very young age, like below 12, have the chance to have what we call native-like pronunciation. It might not be, which is a relative term, right? So phonology seems to be an area of development that's very influenced by the age when someone started learning. Another important part about development of phonology is that someone's ability to perceive a phonological difference affects their ability to produce it. So in general, we think that if somebody cannot hear the difference between two sounds, it's very difficult. It's going to be very difficult for them to produce that difference. So an example would be L and R for speakers of, for example, Japanese. Light and right sound the same to them. It's very difficult for them to develop their pronunciation of that. They have to work first on the perception and hearing the difference before they can produce it. In terms of development of vocabulary, the authors point out that we do have a huge number of words and word families, and that second language acquisition of vocabulary requires massive amount of learning. But that word families, seeing how words are connected, even new or difficult academic words like collaborate, collaboration, collaborative, collaboratively, grouping words in that way can be very helpful. There's lots of information that people need to know about each word and how it can be used, and that some people map their vocabulary acquisition to L1 concepts. So sometimes vocabulary is actually different between the L1 and the L2, even in cognates. So for example, I mentioned the word collaborate. In Spanish, the verb colaborar can also be used to mean like donate money to a cause or contribute money to a cause, but we don't usually use that word like, would you like to collaborate? By itself in English would not really probably carry that meaning of donating money to something. So that it's very normal to map new vocabulary to our L1 concepts, but sometimes the match is not complete or exactly complete. In terms of acquisition of grammar, there's a lot of evidence for staged and developmental acquisition, that there does seem to be a fixed order in which people develop their their capacity to learn different verb forms or other parts of the grammar. Of course, I think the textbook does a great job of pointing out there are also individual differences within the fixed areas. Individuals might acquire grammar differently. This is the same in terms of sociolinguistics and pragmatics, which means like politeness in the L2, or what is considered polite language, what is considered polite responses, or things like that might also be staged development. In terms of reading development, the conclusion from most current research is that two things affect reading development: a person's reading skill in their first language and their second language proficiency. So I think this is especially important to keep in mind when we have students from immigrant or refugee backgrounds who come to the United States from other countries. How far were they able to get with their reading skill in their first language before moving? And how much academic vocabulary or higher tier vocabulary were they able to acquire? So that will be a contributing factor in addition to their proficiency in English. And finally, not really a skill area, but the chapter mentions corpora, which corpora in general just means collections of data about a language. So we use corpora, for example, to see which adjectives go with which nouns and other collocations, but the textbook also points out that corpora of learners' language, people who are in the process, in that developmental process of learning a language, as those data sets kind of grow larger, we may be able to have more insight into people's language development at different stages of the acquisition process. Thank you.